The rain in western Washington did not merely fall, it possessed the land. On a desolate Tuesday night in late October, the downpour came in violent sheets, hammering against the windshield of the Ford police interceptor with a fury that rendered the wipers useless. The air was a freezing damp weight that soaked through heavy boots and settled deep within the bones. For Officer Tommy Wade, a 15-year veteran of the Ridgeview Police Department, the storm was just another personal insult in a lifetime of grievances. At 42 years old, carrying 30 pounds of soft weight around his waist and a permanent scowl on his weathered face, Wade was stewing in a toxic broth of bitterness. Earlier that month, he had been passed over for promotion to sergeant for the third time in 5 years. In Wade's mind, his stagnant career had nothing to do with his mounting stack of civilian complaints, his documented anger management issues, or his chronic inability to follow department protocol. He blamed the system. He blamed the brass at headquarters, the liberal politicians in Seattle, and, most of all, the department's new diversity initiatives. To Wade, the world was a strict, uncompromising hierarchy, and he firmly believed he was being unjustly pushed down the ladder by people who didn't belong in his city. He cruised down Route 114, a dark stretch of highway that skirted the affluent, heavily forested suburbs of Pierce County. The road was notoriously treacherous, flanked by steep, muddy embankments and completely lacking streetlights. Most sensible drivers stayed off it during a torrential downpour, but Wade was on the tail end of a grueling double shift, assigned to patrol the outer perimeter where the suburban paved roads dissolved into rural state territory. Through the blur of rain and the rhythmic, metallic thumping of his wipers, Wade spotted a pair of hazard lights blinking desperately on the narrow shoulder ahead. He slowed the cruiser, his tires hissing on the slick, flooded asphalt. Squinting through the glass, he made out the shape of a late-model black Audi SUV. It was tilted awkwardly to the passenger side, its front tire visibly shredded and sagging against the rim. Wade felt a familiar, ugly curl of annoyance in his gut. He didn't want to do the paperwork. He didn't want to step out into the freezing deluge, and he certainly didn't want to play the Good Samaritan. But protocol dictated he check it out, if only to log the vehicle before the county tow trucks arrived. He pulled up behind the Audi, flipping on his overhead strobes. The spinning red and blue lights instantly bathed the dark highway in a chaotic, blinding glare. He ran the license plate through the mobile data terminal mounted on his dashboard. The plates were out of state, Illinois, a rental. Inside the quiet cabin of the Audi, David Harrison let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Thank God," he murmured, watching the flashing emergency lights bounce off his rearview mirror. "It's the police. We're going to be all right." David was a tall, broad-shouldered man of 48, with a neatly trimmed graying beard and eyes that had seen more than their fair share of the world's harsh realities. Typically dressed in bespoke, tailored suits, tonight he wore a simple charcoal gray university sweatshirt and worn jeans. It had been an exhausting cross-country flight, followed by a long drive from the airport. Hoping to get his family to their new suburban home before the worst of the storm hit, he had trusted a GPS unit that routed them onto this miserable, unlit highway right before a jagged piece of road debris tore their front tire to shreds. In the passenger seat, his wife, Sarah, pulled her heavy knit cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "Are they getting out? It's freezing out there, David. Lily is shaking." In the back seat, their 8-year-old daughter, Lily, was huddled tightly under a fleece travel blanket. She had developed a mild fever on the flight, and the sudden drop in temperature inside the dead vehicle was making her shiver uncontrollably. The Audi's battery had inexplicably died just minutes after they pulled over, killing the engine, the heater, and their hopes of keeping warm. To compound their nightmare, this specific hollow on Route 114 was a notorious dead zone for cellular reception. For the last 45 minutes, they had been entirely invisible to the world. "He's running our plates," David said, his voice carrying a calm, deep resonance that immediately acted as an anchor for his family. Standard procedure. Let me do the talking, sweetheart. I'll get him to call a tow, and maybe he'll let us sit in the back of his cruiser to warm up while we wait. Back in the patrol car, Wade grabbed his heavy metallic flashlight and shoved his yellow rain slicker over his broad shoulders. He stepped out into the deluge. The wind-driven rain bit at his face like needles. He slammed the cruiser door and marched toward the Audi, his hand resting instinctively on his utility belt. As he approached the driver's side, he didn't tap the glass politely. Instead, he aimed the blinding, high-lumen beam of his flashlight directly into the side view mirror, intentionally projecting the glare into the driver's eyes. It was an intimidation tactic, plain and simple, a way to establish dominance before a single word was spoken. David rolled down the window, allowing the roar of the storm and the freezing rain to invade the warm cabin. "Evening, officer," David said, his tone remarkably polite and level. He raised a hand to shield his eyes from the blinding glare. "I can't tell you how glad we are to see you. We hit some debris about a mile back, completely destroyed the front tire, and then our electrical system just died on us. We've been stranded out here for nearly an hour." Wade didn't answer right away. He kept the flashlight beam trained directly on David's face, slowly scanning the dark skin, the casual clothes, and the rental paperwork sitting on the dashboard. He panned the light over to Sarah, who winced against the glare, and then swept it across the back seat, illuminating the pale, frightened face of little Lily. In Wade's mind, a narrative was already crystallizing. An expensive European SUV, out-of-state plates, a black family on the outskirts of an affluent neighborhood. His biases, nurtured by years of unchecked cynicism and resentment, flared to life. "License and registration," Wade demanded, his voice a flat, authoritative bark that barely carried over the howling wind. "Of course," David said, keeping his movements slow, deliberate, and visible. "It's a rental, so the agreement is in the glove box. My wallet is in my back pocket. I'm going to reach for it now." "Just hand me the ID, pal," Wade snapped, shifting his weight and resting his hand closer to his sidearm. He didn't like how calm David was. Usually, when Wade pulled over motorists of color in this part of the county, they were visibly anxious, eager to please, or defensive. David's measured, unbothered demeanor felt like a direct challenge to his authority. David pulled his wallet out and slid his Illinois driver's license through the narrow window gap. Wade snatched it, wiping the rainwater off the plastic with his thumb. "David Harrison," Wade read aloud, his voice dripping with skepticism. He leaned in closer, the scent of stale coffee and wet polyester radiating off his uniform. "What brings you out to Ridgeview, David? You're a long way from Chicago." "We're relocating here," David explained, his voice remaining remarkably steady despite the freezing wind spraying water across his left shoulder. "I just flew in today. We were heading to our new address when the tire blew. Our phones don't have any signal out here. If you could radio your dispatch and request a flatbed tow, we'd be incredibly grateful." "Relocating to Ridgeview?" Wade asked, completely ignoring the request for a tow. He peered deeper into the car. "Is that right? Pretty expensive neighborhood for a guy who doesn't even know how to change a flat tire." Sarah shifted in her seat, her maternal instincts overriding her caution. "Officer, the rental company didn't put a spare tire or a jack in the trunk, and as my husband said, our battery is completely dead. Our daughter in the back has a fever and she's freezing. Please, we just need some help." Wade flashed the light directly into Sarah's eyes, blinding her. "I'm talking to the driver, lady. Keep your mouth shut." David's jaw tightened. The easy, cooperative posture he had maintained vanished, replaced by a rigid, absolute stillness. The air inside the Audi seemed to drop another 10 degrees. When he spoke next, his voice was no longer merely polite. It was quiet, deep, and dangerously precise. "My wife is naturally concerned about our child, officer. There is absolutely no need to speak to her in that manner. We are citizens asking for basic roadside assistance. What you're doing, Wade sneered, leaning his heavy forearms against the wet window frame, is impeding traffic on a state highway. You're a public hazard. We are pulled completely onto the gravel shoulder, well past the white line, David pointed out. I decide what constitutes a hazard on this road, Wade growled. He stepped back from the vehicle, tapping the door panel with his heavy flashlight. Stay in the vehicle. Don't make any sudden movements. Wade marched back to his cruiser, leaving the family in the dark. He sat behind the wheel, feeling the violent vibration of the storm against the roof, and stared at the name on the license. He ran David Harrison through the national NCIC database. Nothing. The record was completely, flawlessly clean. Not a single parking ticket, not a warning, not a civil judgment. The lack of a record irritated Wade even further. He hated when the people he profiled didn't fit into the neat, criminal boxes he had constructed for them over 15 years of policing. He keyed his shoulder mic. Dispatch, this is Unit 4 Bravo. I've got a disabled black Audi SUV on Route 114 northbound, near mile marker 12. Copy, 4 Bravo. The dispatcher's voice crackled back through the static. Do you require a heavy wrecker or a standard flatbed? Wade looked through his rain-streaked windshield at the dark, silent Audi. He thought about David's quiet dignity, the way the man had looked at him, not with fear, but with a cold, analytical intellect. Wade wanted to break that dignity. He wanted to teach this outsider a lesson about who held the real power in Pierce County. Negative, dispatch, Wade lied smoothly. Occupants state they have a private tow already en route. I'm going to issue a citation for failure to maintain a safe vehicle and clear the scene. It's getting a bit too active out here. Copy that, 4 Bravo. Clear to proceed. Wade printed a citation from his terminal. It was a petty, ridiculous ticket. Code 402, obstructing a public roadway, carrying a hefty $200 fine. He clipped the paper to his board, stepped back out into the freezing rain, and walked back to the Audi. He did not know it yet, but with every step he took through the mud, Tommy Wade was marching toward the absolute destruction of his own life. He approached the driver's side and shoved the clipboard through the window. Sign the bottom. David looked at the paper, his eyes scanning the fine print in the dim, strobing light of the police cruiser. He looked up at Wade, his face an unreadable mask. You're giving me a ticket for a blowout. I'm giving you a citation for operating an unsafe vehicle and creating a hazard on a state highway, Wade corrected, a malicious, self-satisfied grin playing at the corners of his mouth. Sign it. It's not an admission of guilt, just an acknowledgement of receipt. Unless you want me to hook you up for failure to comply. Your choice, David. Officer, please, Sarah pleaded, her voice trembling from the cold. Look at our daughter. She's shivering. Just call the tow truck. You can write us 10 tickets. Just get us out of the cold. Wade ignored her completely, keeping his eyes locked onto David's. Tick-tock, driver. I've got actual crimes to police tonight. David took the cheap plastic pen. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. A lesser man might have snapped under the weight of the humiliation and the fear for his family, letting his anger boil over into a confrontation that Wade would have gladly used to justify physical force. But David Harrison possessed an almost terrifying degree of self-control. He signed his name with a perfectly steady hand. As he handed the clipboard back, David locked eyes with Wade. For a split second, the blue strobes illuminated the silver nameplate on Wade's chest and the gold badge pinned above his heart. Officer T. Wade, badge number 4092. David committed it to memory. Are you going to dispatch that tow truck now, Officer Wade? Wade ripped the yellow carbon copy of the citation from the pad and tossed it onto David's lap. Like I said, I'm not your personal concierge, and I don't run a taxi service for people who don't know how to keep a vehicle running. You can walk up to the gas station at the Route 9 interchange. It's about 3 miles north. Maybe someone there will care, Sarah gasped. 3 miles in this storm with a sick child? Are you insane? Wade leaned his face in, inches from the open window, his hot breath fogging the glass. I'm warning you, lady. You raise your voice to an officer of the law again, and you'll be spending the night in a holding cell while Child Protective Services takes custody of your kid. Do we understand each other? Each. David's hand shot out, resting gently but firmly on his wife's knee. It was a silent command. Do not engage. We understand you perfectly, Officer Wade, David said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant timbre that carried a chilling weight of absolute authority. You have made your position very clear. We will handle it from here. Good boy, Wade muttered, tapping the roof of the Audi mockingly with his flashlight. Welcome to Ridgeview. Wade turned his back on the family, walked to his cruiser, and climbed inside. He cut his overhead lights, plunging the Audi back into absolute suffocating darkness. He threw the patrol car into drive and accelerated away, his rear tires kicking up a massive wave of muddy road water that splashed violently against the side of the Harrisons' dead vehicle. Inside the freezing SUV, there was a long, heavy silence, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain. In the back, Lily began to cry softly. Daddy, I'm cold. Why was that policeman so mean to us? Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and scrambled into the back seat, pulling Lily into her arms, trying to envelope the little girl in her own body heat. It's okay, baby. Mommy's got you. David, what do? We can't walk 3 miles in this. David gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. The fury he had suppressed was finally allowed to breathe, but it did not manifest as a useless outburst. It hardened into something cold, sharp, and entirely focused. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his dead phone, and tossed it onto the passenger seat. Then he reached into the center glove compartment. We wait, David said quietly. We wait for another vehicle. I'm going to set up the emergency flares from the trunk. He just left us here, Sarah whispered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and raw anger. He looked at a sick child in a freezing car, and he smiled as he drove away. David, he knew exactly what he was doing. I know, David replied, unzipping a duffel bag on the floorboard and pulling out a thick wool sweater. He handed it back to his wife. Put this over her. And yes, he knew exactly what he was doing. He thought he was unaccountable. He thought we were nobody. David zipped his jacket up to his throat and cracked his door open. Lock the doors behind me. I'm going to light the flares. Someone will stop. For the next 2 hours, the Harrison family endured a cold, terrifying nightmare. David stood by the shoulder of Route 114, soaked to the skin, waving a red magnesium flare at the occasional headlights that braved the storm. Several cars sped past, terrified of stopping on a dark, flooded highway in the middle of the night. Finally, just past midnight, a massive 18-wheeler slowly ground to a halt, its air brakes hissing loudly in the wet air. The driver, a burly, bearded man named Hank, leaned out of his cab window. You folks all right out here? We need a tow, David shouted back, shivering violently but keeping his composure. And a ride to safety. My daughter is sick. Hank didn't hesitate. Get them up into the cab. I've got a heater in here that'll roast a turkey. We'll call a heavy wrecker from my CB radio. By the time the family was safely inside the roaring, warm cabin of the semi, David's phone had finally caught a weak sliver of signal while charging on the trucker's dashboard port. It instantly buzzed with 13 missed calls and a barrage of urgent text messages. The top message was from Mayor Richard Hayes. David, heard about the flight delays. Just checking in. The press conference is set for 10 a.m. tomorrow. This department is a complete disaster, David. We need you. See you in the morning. David stared at the glowing screen, the wet yellow traffic ticket still sitting on his lap. He thought about Officer Wade's arrogant smirk. He thought about his daughter shivering in the dark. Is everything all right, David? Sarah asked softly, cradling Lily, who had finally drifted off to sleep in the warmth of the truck. David looked out the window at the passing highway. "Everything is fine, Sarah. In fact, I think I'm going to be very busy tomorrow." The Ridgeview Police Department was a chaotic, aging brick fortress that smelled perpetually of cheap floor wax, stale coffee, and old sweat. At 8 a.m. the next morning, the bullpen was buzzing with an electric, nervous energy. Rumors had been circulating for weeks. The department was reeling from a massive federal civil rights probe that had exposed deep-rooted corruption, systemic excessive force, and rampant racial profiling within the ranks. The previous police chief had been forced to resign in absolute disgrace, taking an early retirement to avoid a federal indictment. In response, Mayor Hayes had promised the citizens of Ridgeview a total systemic overhaul. He had promised an outsider, a reformer, who wouldn't just trim the branches of the department's toxic culture, but would rip it out by the very roots. Officer Tommy Wade sat at his cluttered metal desk, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and typing up his shift reports from the night before with 2 stiff fingers. Despite his physical exhaustion, he felt a smug, twisted sense of satisfaction. The memory of the black family he had left, stranded on Route 114, was a little trophy he carried in his mind, a reminder that, despite his lack of promotion, he still held the power of life and death on the streets. His partner, a younger, easily impressionable officer named Greg, leaned over the plastic desk partition. "Rough night out there, Tommy?" "Same old garbage, Greg," Wade grunted, taking a slow sip of his bitter coffee. "Handed out a few citations. Had some city slicker out on Route 114 trying to tell me how to do my job. His fancy SUV broke down, and the guy thought because he drove an Audi, I was going to be his personal roadside assistance." Greg chuckled. "What did you do?" "Told him to start walking," Wade smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Slapped him with a 402 for blocking the roadway. You should have seen his face. These people come into our city thinking they own the place. Sometimes you've just got to remind them who actually wears the badge." Before Greg could respond, the heavy double doors of the bullpen swung open, and Captain Gregory Miller marched in. Miller was a stern, no-nonsense veteran who had survived decades of political shifts by keeping his head down and his record clean. But today, Miller looked incredibly pale. His face was drawn, and his hands were visibly trembling. "Listen up! All available personnel, front and center, right now!" Captain Miller barked, clapping his hands. Chairs scraped loudly against the worn linoleum. Phone receivers were slammed down. Within seconds, 50 uniformed officers and plainclothes detectives gathered in a loose semicircle around the captain's podium at the front of the room. Wade dragged his feet, standing near the back row, leaning casually against a metal filing cabinet with his arms crossed. "As you all know," Captain Miller began, his voice echoing sharply off the cinder-block walls, "the mayor's office has been conducting a nationwide search for our new police commissioner to oversee the entire municipal district. The official announcement is being made to the press at City Hall in an hour, but the mayor and our new boss wanted to address this precinct directly first, starting with us." A low, anxious murmur rippled through the crowd of officers. "Quiet," Miller snapped. "This department is on life support. The feds are watching us. The media is watching us. The public wants our heads. The man stepping into this role is not one of us. He comes from the outside. He spent 25 years with Chicago PD, rose to deputy superintendent, and holds a law degree from Northwestern. He is a tactician, an absolute enforcer of policy, and he does not play games." Wade rolled his eyes, whispering quietly to Greg. "Great. Another suit with a law degree. Probably hasn't seen a real street in 15 years. I want absolute, flawless professionalism," Miller continued, ignoring the back row muttering. "He is touring the precinct today to lay out his new zero-tolerance policy for officer misconduct. He is currently in the building. Stand at attention." The room collectively stiffened. Wade lazily uncrossed his arms and stood up straight, though his face maintained a mask of bored indifference. The side door near the captain's office opened. Mayor Richard Hayes walked in first, flanked by a formidable, stone-faced security detail. The mayor looked incredibly serious, his eyes scanning the room of assembled officers. "Good morning, gentlemen," Mayor Hayes said, stepping up to the microphone. "I won't waste your time with a long speech. You all know why we are here. Structural change is no longer optional in this city. It is mandatory. To lead that change, I have brought in a man of impeccable integrity. A man who understands the letter of the law, and more importantly, understands the spirit of justice. I introduce your new police commissioner." The mayor stepped aside. From the shadows of the hallway, a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped into the harsh, fluorescent light of the bullpen. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored dark navy Italian suit, a crisp white shirt, and a deep maroon tie. He carried himself with an aura of absolute, undeniable command. His posture was perfect, his gaze sharp and sweeping. It was David Harrison. Tommy Wade's breath caught violently in his throat. His heart skipped a beat, then began hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. No, Wade thought, a cold, icy sweat instantly breaking out across his forehead and dripping down the back of his neck. No, 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 that's impossible. That can't be him. David stepped up to the podium. He placed a single manila folder on the wooden surface. He didn't look at his notes. He didn't look at the mayor. He simply let his dark, piercing eyes drift slowly across the sea of blue uniforms. Wade felt the blood drain entirely from his face. His hands began to tremble so violently he had to tuck them behind his utility belt to hide the movement. He tried to shrink back behind Greg's shoulder, tried to make his large frame invisible, but the bullpen was too brightly lit, and there was nowhere to hide. David's eyes swept the left side of the room, moved slowly across the center, and then stopped. He locked eyes directly with Tommy Wade, standing in the back row. The commissioner didn't blink. He didn't smile. The same calm, unnerving stillness that Wade had mocked just 10 hours ago on a dark, wet highway was now radiating from the podium. But this time, it was backed by the full, crushing authority of the municipal government. David held Wade's gaze for 5 agonizing, silent seconds. To Wade, it felt like an eternity. In those 5 seconds, Wade's entire 15-year career flashed before his eyes. Every corner cut, every civilian complaint buried, every minor abuse of power. It all culminated in the yellow citation he had thrown onto the lap of the man who now held absolute power over his life. "Good morning, officers," Commissioner David Harrison began, his deep, resonant voice commanding absolute silence. He did not break eye contact with Wade. "My name is David Harrison, and we have a monumental amount of work to do." Commissioner Harrison's arrival was not a mere shift in leadership. It was a reckoning. Within his first 48 hours, Harrison established a dedicated internal task force to review all pending civilian complaints, active patrol logs, and municipal citations. But the rot within the Ridgeview Police Department ran far deeper than a single bitter highway cop. For years, a powerful faction within the precinct had operated like an untouchable street gang. At the center of this faction was Chief of Patrol Arthur Gable and his golden boy, Officer Derek Stanton. Stanton was a brutal, highly aggressive physical specimen who viewed the streets not as a community to protect, but as an active combat zone. Backed by the local police union and protected by Chief Gable's political maneuvering, Stanton had survived multiple excessive force investigations, his files always mysteriously disappearing into a bureaucratic fog. But while the department's old guard believed they could weather the storm of Harrison's new administration, they were entirely unaware that the federal government had already set a trap. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division had been quietly conducting a covert investigation into the Ridgeview Police Department for 6 months. Leading the ground operation was Special Agent Ray Reynolds, a highly decorated federal operative who specialized in deep-cover public corruption cases. Ray was a man of quiet intensity, with a sharp mind and a body hardened by years of tactical service. On a cold Thursday evening, 3 weeks after Commissioner Harrison took office, a massive protest erupted in downtown Ridgeview, following the controversial shooting of an unarmed teenager by a local patrol officer. The streets were a powder keg of tension, filled with chanting crowds, flashing police lights, and a heavy air of mutual hostility. Officer Derek Stanton and his rookie partner, Liam O'Connor, were stationed on the front skirmish line, clad in heavy riot gear. O'Connor was a 22-year-old rookie, barely 3 months out of the academy, whose face was currently a mask of pure terror. "Keep your line, kid," Stanton growled through his helmet visor, his fingers flexing tightly around his heavy wooden riot baton. "Don't let these animals think you're soft." In the crowd, dressed in a mud-splattered dark coat and a gray woolen beanie, was Special Agent Ray Reynolds. Ray was operating undercover, carrying a concealed, highly advanced digital recording device and keeping a watchful eye on the skirmish line to document potential civil rights violations. The crowd surged forward as a firecracker exploded near the police line. In the ensuing chaos, Stanton saw his opportunity. He broke formation, his eyes locking onto Ray, who was standing peacefully near a street lamp, recording the scene with a small, handheld camera. Back up now!" Stanton roared, lunging forward. "I am complying, officer," Ray said calmly, raising his hands, his camera clearly visible. "I am stepping back." But Stanton didn't want compliance. He wanted a target. He violently rammed his heavy plastic shield into Ray's chest, sending him crashing onto the wet asphalt. Before Ray could recover, Stanton descended upon him, swinging his wooden baton with brutal, unhinged force. "Stanton, stop! He's complying!" Rookie O'Connor yelled, his voice cracking with panic as he watched his partner strike the defenseless man repeatedly. "Shut up, Liam!" Stanton screamed, landing a vicious blow to Ray's ribs. "He reached for my belt. He's resisting." Ray lay on the cold ground, his hands flat against the asphalt, absorbing the brutal impacts. He felt a rib crack, a sharp, blinding pain radiating through his side, but his mind remained entirely clear. He looked up through the rain, locking eyes with Stanton. "You're making a mistake, officer," Ray whispered, blood pooling in his mouth. "Shut your mouth, street trash," Stanton hissed, pulling Ray's arms behind his back and ratcheting the metal handcuffs so tightly they cut deep into Ray's wrists. "You're going into a cage." At 10 p.m. that same night, Chief Arthur Gable drove his unmarked Ford Explorer through the flooded streets of Ridgeview, his tires hydroplaning violently as he tore toward the precinct's subterranean garage. Gable was a man who had spent 30 years building a meticulously manicured reputation. He knew how to bury a scandal, how to pressure victims into dropping complaints, and how to leverage the police union to make problems disappear. But as he slammed his vehicle into his private parking space, a cold, suffocating dread gripped his chest. An hour ago, he had received a frantic call from the precinct property clerk. They had run the fingerprints of the protester Stanton had just arrested for felony assault on an officer. The system hadn't returned a local criminal record. It had returned a secure, high-level federal alert. You do not bury the FBI. You survive them only if you are incredibly lucky. Gable burst through the heavy steel doors of the booking area. He was completely out of breath, his expensive trench coat soaked with rain, his face flushed a deep, panicked red. The usual chaotic din of the booking room dropped to a dead silence as the officers noticed the chief of police sprinting past the holding cells. He marched straight to the property desk, where Sergeant Miller was standing, looking physically ill. "Where is it?" Gable demanded, his voice a harsh, breathless whisper. Miller didn't say a word. He simply reached under the desk and slid a black leather credentials case across the scratched laminate counter. Gable picked it up and flipped it open. The gold federal shield caught the harsh overhead fluorescent light, throwing a blinding glare into the chief's eyes. Next to the shield was a pristine federal ID card. Special Agent Ray Reynolds, Department of Justice, Internal Corruption Task Force. God almighty, Gable muttered, running a trembling hand over his thinning hair. He felt the blood completely leave his extremities. Where is he? Interview room 2, Miller replied, his eyes darting nervously toward the hallway. Chief, he's hurt. Stanton busted his ribs. His face is a mess, and his leg is badly bruised. He refused medical attention, said he wanted his federal legal counsel, and wouldn't say a single word until they arrived. Gable slammed the credentials case shut, his mind racing through 100 different disaster scenarios. An undercover federal agent brutally beaten in local custody, a fabricated arrest report, a rookie witness. This wasn't just a lawsuit. This was a federal consent decree waiting to happen. The Department of Justice would come in, strip Gable of his command, dismantle the union, and place the entire Ridgeview Police Department under federal receivership. Where is Stanton? Gable snapped. Right here, Chief. Gable spun around. Officer Derek Stanton was sauntering out of the bullpen, a fresh cup of coffee in one hand and a copy of his freshly printed incident report in the other. He looked thoroughly pleased with himself, entirely oblivious to the nuclear bomb sitting on the property desk. Behind him hovered a pale, ghost-like Liam O'Connor. Chief, what brings you down here? Stanton asked, a smug grin playing on his lips. If it's about the protest, we've got it completely under control. Bagged the primary instigator. Wrote him up for felony resisting and assault on a peace officer. O'Connor here corroborated the entire sequence of events. Gable looked at Stanton, feeling an intense, sudden surge of hatred for the man. For years, Gable had looked the other way, justifying Stanton's brutality as the necessary cost of maintaining order. Now, that willful ignorance was about to cost Gable his pension, his reputation, and his freedom. You wrote the report? Gable asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Signed and dated, Stanton said proudly, tapping the paper. Felony charges. He won't see daylight until the arraignment. Give it to me. Stanton, slightly confused by the chief's icy demeanor, handed the paper over. Gable scanned the document. Suspect assumed an aggressive fighting stance, fearing for my safety, applied necessary compliance techniques. Every single word was a calculated, perjured lie. Did he really reach for your belt, O'Connor? Gable asked, locking his eyes onto the trembling rookie. O'Connor swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply. Yes, sir, I saw it. Gable slowly tore the incident report right down the middle. Then he tore it again, letting the white pieces flutter down onto the wet linoleum floor. Chief, what the hell are you doing? Stanton's smugness instantly vanished, replaced by defensive anger. That's an official department document. You deaf, dumb, arrogant son of a bitch, Gable hissed, stepping directly into Stanton's personal space, grabbing him by the heavy nylon straps of his tactical vest. His voice vibrated with a barely contained hysterical rage. Do you have any idea what you just did? Do you have any idea who you just put in a cage? A street rat, Stanton shot back, pushing Gable's hands away. A rioter. Gable turned, grabbed the black leather federal credentials case from the counter, and violently shoved it into Stanton's chest. Open it, Stanton frowned, catching the wallet. He flipped it open. Gable watched the exact moment the realization hit him. It was instantaneous. The arrogant, untouchable posture vanished. Stanton's broad shoulders sagged. His eyes widened, his pupils dilating in pure, unadulterated terror as his brain processed the gold shield and the federal ID card. His breathing completely stopped. No, Stanton whispered, his voice cracking. No, this is fake. He bought this online. He was with the protesters. It's real, Derek, Gable said, stepping back from him as if Stanton were carrying a contagious disease. He's Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. They've been building a case against this department for 6 months, and you just served yourself up to them on a silver platter. O'Connor let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Oh my God. Oh my God. I lied. I lied on a sworn federal statement. You did, son, Gable said grimly. And you did it to a federal agent. Stanton backed up, shaking his head rapidly, his hands trembling. Chief, listen to me. We can fix this. He doesn't have any proof. It's his word against two sworn officers. We delete the booking logs. We wipe the garage cameras. We tell him he's free to go. A misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? Gable laughed, a hollow, desperate sound that echoed off the walls. You broke his ribs, you idiot. You think the FBI sent an undercover agent into a riot zone without active overwatch? You think they don't have a tactical team sitting in a surveillance van down the street, tracking his every breath? As if summoned by the chief's words, the heavy security doors of the precinct garage exploded open. The Ridgeview officers didn't even have time to reach for their radios. 12 men and women flooded into the booking area, moving with precise, terrifying tactical coordination. They wore dark navy windbreakers with large, bold yellow letters plastered across the back. FBI. They bypassed the metal detectors. They ignored the shouting desk sergeant. Leading the pack was Special Agent in Charge David Harper, a tall, severe-looking man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that looked like shattered glass. He carried an aura of absolute, undeniable federal authority. Flanking him were 2 federal paramedics carrying heavy trauma bags and 3 tactical agents with their hands resting purposefully on the grips of their holstered sidearms. "Federal agents, secure the perimeter!" one of the agents shouted, though the command was entirely unnecessary. The Ridgeview cops had completely frozen, utterly paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming invasion of their sanctuary. SAC Harper walked straight up to Chief Gable, stopping mere inches from his face. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't offer a hand. "Chief Gable, I am Special Agent in Charge David Harper, Department of Justice," he said, his voice carrying a chilling, calm authority that echoed in the dead silence of the room. "You are currently holding a federal agent in your custody against his will. You have exactly 10 seconds to hand over the keys to his cell, or my team will dismantle this precinct, brick by brick, to get to him." Gable's hands shook violently as he looked at Sergeant Miller. "Give him the keys. Give him the keys right now." Miller scrambled, his fingers fumbling with the heavy brass key ring. He handed them to one of the FBI agents, who immediately sprinted down the hallway toward interview room 2, followed closely by the paramedics. Harper turned his icy, unblinking gaze to Derek Stanton. Stanton was practically vibrating with panic, still clutching the federal credentials case in his wet hands. "Officer Stanton," Harper said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Put the badge on the counter and step away." Stanton complied, dropping the leather wallet onto the laminate surface as if it were on fire. He backed up until his spine hit the concrete wall. Listen to me. I didn't know. He didn't identify himself. He didn't declare. You didn't give him a chance." A quiet, raspy voice echoed from the hallway. Everyone turned. Ray Reynolds was walking slowly out of the holding area. He was limping heavily, leaning slightly on one of the federal paramedics, but his posture was unyielding. His heavy coat was gone, leaving him in a mud-stained, damp t-shirt. A dark, vicious bruise was already blooming along his jawline, and his wrists were banded with deep purple contusions from the over-tightened handcuffs. Despite the physical injuries, the shift in the room's power dynamic was palpable. He wasn't a defenseless civilian anymore. He was the apex predator, and Stanton was the prey. "Agent Reynolds," Harper said, his severe expression softening just a fraction. "Status: severe contusions, suspected rib fractures, heavy bruising to the left femur," Ray reported in a clinical, detached voice. He locked his dark eyes onto Stanton. "And a thoroughly documented violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of civil rights under color of law." Stanton swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. "It's my word against yours. You were resisting. You have no proof of excessive force." Ray let out a slow, sharp exhale, wincing slightly as his injured ribs shifted. He reached up to his gray woolen beanie, which was still firmly planted on his head. He dug his fingers into the thick wool near the fold and pulled out a tiny black disc, no larger than a shirt button. A microscopic green light pulsed steadily on its surface. "Class 4 encrypted microtransmitter," Ray said softly, holding it up for the room to see. "Transmitting high-definition audio directly to a secure federal server in real time. I have you on tape muttering threats. I have the sound of your baton hitting my ribs while my hands were flat on the asphalt. I have Officer O'Connor begging you to stop." O'Connor dropped his face into his hands, sobbing openly. "But that's just the audio," Ray continued, his voice slicing through Stanton's remaining bravado like a scalpel. "Did you notice the surveillance drone hovering above the intersection of 4th and Pike tonight, Derek? It wasn't a local news chopper. It was a high-altitude federal tactical drone. We have thermal and 4K optical footage of the entire 90 seconds. We watched you break formation, target a non-combatant, and initiate unprovoked, excessive force." Stanton's knees buckled. He slid slowly down the cinder block wall, his breath coming in ragged, hyperventilating gasps. The blue wall of silence had just shattered into a million pieces, and he was standing at the absolute epicenter of the blast. "Chief Gable," Ray turned to the paralyzed chief of police. "Your officer arrested me under false pretenses. He fabricated an official police report. His partner committed perjury. Under the authority of the United States Attorney General, we are taking immediate federal jurisdiction of this precinct." He looked back at Stanton, his eyes entirely devoid of sympathy. "David," Ray said, nodding to S.A.C. Harper. "Arrest him." Two beefy FBI agents stepped forward, grabbing Derek Stanton by his arms. They hauled him to his feet, forcefully turning him around. "Derek Stanton, you are under arrest for federal civil rights violations, aggravated assault under color of law, and falsifying official records." The agent read the Miranda warning, his voice loud and clear. The heavy metallic clack of the federal handcuffs echoing in the booking room sounded entirely different from standard local cuffs. It sounded like the heavy, unyielding slam of a vault door. As Stanton was dragged out of his own precinct, stripped of his badge, his service weapon, and his power, he looked back at Ray. Ray wasn't smiling. He was already turning away, sitting down with the paramedics to begin documenting the exact physical cost of a corrupt cop's arrogance. The nightmare for Derek Stanton had only just begun. By midnight, the Ridgeview Police Department had been entirely neutralized. The standard local police radio frequencies were silent, replaced by the encrypted chatter of federal agents securing filing cabinets, copying hard drives, and boxing up a decade's worth of buried internal affairs complaints. S.A.C. Harper treated the precinct not as a partner agency, but as an active crime scene. In a stark, windowless interrogation room on the federal side of town, Derek Stanton sat in a stainless steel chair. He was no longer wearing his tactical gear or his proud uniform. He wore a shapeless, oversized gray federal holding jumpsuit. The swagger was entirely gone, replaced by the jittery, wide-eyed panic of an animal that had just realized the trap had closed. The heavy steel door opened, and Thomas Riggins walked in. Riggins was the powerful head of the local police benevolent association, the union boss. He was a bulldog of a man who had personally pulled Stanton out of the fire on 3 separate excessive force investigations. "Tommy," Stanton breathed, a massive sigh of relief escaping his chest as he leaned forward, his handcuff chains rattling loudly against the table. "Thank God. Tell me you got the federal injunction. Tell me we're squashing this." It was a chaotic scene, Tommy. I didn't know who he was. Riggins didn't sit down. He didn't open his leather briefcase. He simply stood by the door, staring at Stanton with an expression of profound, terminal disgust. "I didn't come here to represent you, Derek," Riggins said, his voice flat and gravelly. I came here to tell you that you are entirely on your own. Stanton blinked, the remaining color draining from his face. What? You have to represent me. I pay my dues. The union has to provide legal counsel. The union protects cops who make honest mistakes in the line of duty, Riggins shot back, his voice rising in anger. We don't protect rogue liabilities who hand the Department of Justice the keys to our city. I just spent an hour in a conference room with Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Dawson. They showed me the drone footage, Derek. Stanton swallowed, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. 90 seconds, Riggins shook his head, looking physically ill. You beat a compliant, non-violent man on high-definition thermal imaging while your rookie partner begged you to stop. And then I listened to the audio from the wire he was wearing. You called him trash while you tried to dislocate his shoulder. You handed them a premeditated civil rights violation wrapped in a bow. I was doing my job. The crowd was hostile. The crowd didn't touch you. You went hunting. Riggins slammed his fist against the steel door. And worse, you made Liam O'Connor lie on a sworn incident report. You corrupted a rookie on his probation. Guess where O'Connor is right now? Stanton's eyes darted nervously. Where? In the room next door, Riggins said grimly. Singing like a choir boy. He's taking a federal immunity deal. He's giving them every single ghost-written report you've filed since 2021. He's telling them about the drop weapons, the planted narcotics, and the cash you skimmed from the evidence locker during the harbor raids. Stanton slumped back in his chair, the air leaving his lungs in a ragged hiss. O'Connor, the terrified kid he had bullied and manipulated for months, was currently dismantling his entire life, piece by piece. We are officially terminating your union membership, effective retroactively to the moment of your arrest, Riggins said, turning the door handle. You're going to need a public defender, Derek, and if I were you, I'd ask for protective custody. Federal penitentiaries aren't particularly kind to dirty cops. The heavy door slammed shut, leaving Stanton alone with the humming fluorescent lights and the crushing weight of his own hubris. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Chief Arthur Gable was clearing out his desk under the watchful, unblinking eyes of two armed federal agents. He hadn't been formally charged yet, but the writing was on the wall. A federal consent decree was coming. The Department of Justice would oversee every single hire, fire, and patrol route in Ridgeview for the next 10 years. Gable's 30-year career had evaporated in a single evening, washed away by the rain and a solid gold federal shield. But the federal purge didn't stop with Stanton and Gable. Commissioner David Harrison, armed with the findings of his internal task force, began a systematic cleaning of the ranks. 3 weeks after his encounter on Route 114, Officer Tommy Wade was summoned to the commissioner's office. He walked in, his heart pounding in his chest, to find David Harrison sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, flanked by Captain Miller and a representative from the state licensing board. On the desk sat a copy of the yellow citation Wade had issued on the highway, alongside a detailed GPS log of Wade's patrol vehicle and a recording of his radio transmission to dispatch. "Officer Wade," Commissioner Harrison said, his voice carrying the same calm, chilling authority from the highway. "You logged a transmission stating the occupants of the black Audi had a private tow en route. You lied to dispatch. You abandoned a family with a sick child in a freezing storm, and you fabricated a citation to cover your malice." Wade opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. "Your badge is stripped, and your police certification is officially revoked," Harrison continued, sliding a termination agreement across the desk. "You are finished in law enforcement, Mr. Wade. If the federal prosecutor decides to include your citation fraud in their broader indictment of this precinct, you will be hearing from them. Get out of my office." Wade signed the paperwork with a trembling hand, his career ending not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating click of a pen. 14 months later, the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington was packed to absolute capacity. The gallery was heavily guarded by armed U.S. Marshals, and the air was thick with the scent of polished oak and federal authority. Rain beat steadily against the high, vaulted windows, a poetic echo of the night. Everything had changed. Derek Stanton stood at the defense table. He was a mere fraction of the man he used to be. His broad shoulders were hunched, his military buzz cut had grown out into thin, graying patches, and his skin had the sickly, pale pallor of a man who had spent a year in solitary confinement awaiting trial. He wore a bright orange federal jumpsuit, his wrists shackled securely to a heavy belly chain. Judge Harrison Caldwell, a man known throughout the federal judiciary for his merciless sentencing guidelines, looked down from his high bench with barely concealed contempt. "Before I hand down this sentence, does the victim wish to address the court?" Judge Caldwell asked, his voice echoing through the silent, cavernous room. In the second row of the gallery, Special Agent Ray Reynolds stood up. He wasn't wearing a mud-stained coat or a gray beanie. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, his gold badge clipped prominently to his belt, his posture flawless and immaculate. He walked past the swinging wooden gates and approached the podium. He moved without a limp, though the medical records submitted to the court detailed the extensive physical therapy he had endured to repair the torn cartilage in his ribs and shoulder. Stanton couldn't bring himself to look at him. He kept his eyes glued to the scuffed mahogany table in front of him. "Your Honor," Ray began, his voice calm, clear, and entirely devoid of personal malice. It was the same analytical, level voice that had warned Stanton he was making a mistake 14 months ago. "I did not come here today to speak about the physical pain of a fractured rib or a torn rotator cuff. Physical injuries heal. The damage the defendant inflicted on the institution of justice, however, is a far deeper wound." He turned his head slightly, forcing Stanton into his peripheral vision. "Derek Stanton did not assault me because he felt threatened. He assaulted me because he believed his badge was a shield against accountability. He preyed on the silence of his peers and the fear of the community. For 17 years, he used a sworn oath as a weapon of intimidation. When he struck me, he didn't know I was a federal agent. He thought I was an ordinary citizen who had no voice, no power, and no recourse. That is the true danger of men like him." Ray gripped the edges of the podium, his gaze steady. The defendant broke the law, but more importantly, he broke the public trust. A badge is a profound responsibility, not a license for brutality. I ask the court to impose the maximum sentence, not for what he did to an FBI agent, but for what he intended to do to an ordinary citizen. He stepped away from the podium and walked back to his seat, his boot heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Judge Caldwell adjusted his glasses and looked down at the disgraced officer. "Mr. Stanton, I have read your personnel file. I have watched the surveillance footage of you striking a defenseless man on the ground. And I have listened to the terrified testimony of your former partner, Liam O'Connor. You are an absolute disgrace to the uniform you wore." Stanton squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear leaking out and cutting a trail through the stubble on his cheek. It wasn't remorse. It was the realization of his own ruin. "The jury has found you guilty on all counts, including deprivation of rights under color of law, aggravated assault, witness tampering, and perjury," Judge Caldwell continued. "Law enforcement officers are the designated guardians of our civil rights. When a guardian becomes a predator, the system must respond with overwhelming severity." Caldwell picked up his heavy wooden gavel. "Derek Stanton, I sentence you to 180 months, 15 years, in a maximum security federal penitentiary, without the possibility of early parole. You are remanded immediately to the custody of the United States Marshals." Bang! The gavel cracked like a gunshot through the silent courtroom. The gallery erupted into quiet, intense murmurs. 15 years in the federal system meant 15 actual years. No good behavior reductions, no easy rides. 2 massive U.S. Marshals stepped forward, grabbing Stanton by his arms. For a brief second, as he was being turned toward the side door leading to the holding cells, Stanton looked up. His eyes met Ray's across the crowded room. He looked broken, terrified, and incredibly small. Ray didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply held Stanton's gaze with the same cold, unblinking certainty he had shown him on the wet asphalt of downtown Ridgeview. He watched the heavy steel door close behind him, sealing him away from the world. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been executed with clinical precision. Ray buttoned his suit jacket and turned toward the main aisle. He had a flight to catch in 3 hours. There was a corrupt narcotics division in Chicago that thought they were untouchable too, and they had absolutely no idea he was coming. Absolute power corrupts, but justice always has the final say. Derek Stanton and Tommy Wade believed a badge made them gods on the streets, but they learned the hard way that nobody is above the law. Ray Reynolds and David Harrison proved that true strength isn't about throwing the first punch. It's about knowing exactly when to close the trap.